Hey everyone, I would first like to thank Hyper Games Conference for giving me this opportunity to speak with you. I'm Sahand Malaei, co-founder and team lead at Dropout Games. We entered the mobile game industry about 4 years ago, and we've been making hyper casual games for the past 2 years. Our most recent achievement was that we recently hit a total of 20 million downloads worldwide for our games, and that was a big milestone for us. And it's worth mentioning that we couldn't have hit that milestone if it weren't for the help of our very good friends over at the publishing team of Funtory Studio. Now, despite our recent success, we've had quite a bumpy ride and we've learned many lessons along the way. And so, what I'm gonna be doing here is to sort of lay down a path and to sort of give you a mindset uh, on how you can avoid many of the mistakes that we made along the way, and so that you won't have to go through all the trouble that we did. And I'm gonna start by talking a little bit about game design and the lessons we learned after having more than 50 of our games fail. And also, I'm going to be talking about the technical side of building hyper casual games and how you can speed up and streamline your game development process. And in the end, I'm going to introduce you to a couple of useful data and analytics solutions and how you can use these tools to find insights about your players' behavior. And so, starting with game design, you should know that every member of the Dropout team comes from a technical background. And so, naturally, we instinctively thought that the most important part of a game is its technical and engineering aspect. What happened over the course of the past 2 years proved to us that we couldn't have been more wrong. And so, after working on more than 50 hyper casual games and prototypes, we sort of stumbled upon a most fundamental principle about game design, which is that your game should be both clear and fun. Now, you might be thinking that that principle is obvious. You might be saying that, well, of course, a game should be both clear and fun. What I can say about that is that we found a lot of successful game design comes to doing the basics really well. And so, while this principle might sound obvious to you, you won't believe how tremendously helpful it's going to be to you over the long run. And I'm going to give you some examples of some of our games that failed because we didn't pay enough attention to this principle. And I'm going to start by showing you one of our games, which we call Swarm Run. The premise here was that we thought it would be fun to control a swarm of insects that are devouring everything on their path. And so the basic concept was pretty fun, and it showed in the first prototypes. But what went wrong was that we got so caught up in trying to make this game look pretty that we actually lost sight of the fact that the game should be fun. And so we polished the game too much. And what we ended up with was a game that was confusing and cluttered. And it wasn't clear to the player what they were supposed to do, what the end goal was, what objects they should pick up, what objects they should avoid. And so the game was pretty confusing to the players. And we paid the price for that with the game's failure. And the game failed and it was a flop. And so the lesson for us here was to never lose sight of the fact that your game should be clear and understandable to the player in the first seconds. Another game that I would like to draw your attention to is a game we called Roast Duel. And so the concept was that we thought roasting people was fun, and it is a fun concept. And we watched a lot of TV shows to sort of try to draw inspiration from the roast competitions on TV. But as we started actually developing this game, we came to the painful conclusion that we simply lacked the comedic talent to make this sort of game fun. And so for this game, it was all about the funny jokes and the funny roasts, and we simply couldn't make this game fun enough. And what we learned was that if you can't make a game fun, you shouldn't make that game at all. And so you should always remember the most basic principle about design hyper-casual games, which is that your game should be both clear and fun. And you won't believe how many times in the long run it's going to help you whenever you're deciding whether to actually build a game concept or to ditch it. And when it comes to hyper-casual, there is something that you should know is that the hyper-casual market moves at an incredibly fast pace. And so it's absolutely necessary that you get your game development pipeline right. And so that brings us to talk a little bit about the technical side of things and how you can speed up how you can speed up the your game development pipeline. And to give you an example of the immense kind of pressure that a hyper casual studio faces in today's market, we, as a small studio of 5 people, have had to work on more than 30 games and prototypes over the past year. And so that puts an immense amount of pressure on the development team. And you need to do as much as you can to take that pressure off of your team. And there are a lot of things you can read on the internet on how you can make your game development pipeline more efficient and how you can speed it up. But the principle that we found that we believe is applicable to every workflow out there is that you should try to reuse as much of your assets and code as possible. And it's always worth it to take some time to think about reusability. And so what we did was that we had a good sense early on to sit down and actually think about which parts of our assets and our code we could actually reuse. And what we came up with was our game framework. And it's a tool we use to make our hyper casual games. And it's so effective that whenever at Dropout Games, whenever you're starting to building a new game, about 80% of the work has already been done for you. And so you can focus exclusively on trying to make your game fun and not have to worry about the technical details. Another interesting thing about our game framework is that we took a modular approach to building it. Now, the way that works is that our framework consists of a number of modules, and each game only needs some of those modules. Now, the advantage, this approach actually had two big advantages for us. First, it sped up our game development process by a lot, and the second advantage that it had for us was that since it was a modular and reusable framework, whenever you were working on a newer game and you added a feature to one of these modules, every other game that also used that module would see that change reflected in that game as well. And so that was the most beautiful thing about our framework, that we while we were working on our newer games, we could automatically build updates for our older games, which still have millions of players. And so not having to think about and worry about maintaining our older games was a huge weight off of our shoulders, and it really sped up our process. And so what I'm trying to say here is not that you should necessarily build a game framework of your own. what I'm trying to say is that it's well worth the time investment to take some time to think about which parts of your games you can reuse for your future games. And in today's super competitive market, that's going to really give you an edge over the competition, because you need every advantage you get, and reusability is certainly one of them. And no talk about hyper casual would be complete without mentioning data. And so our story was that we started off as any other studio would, and we used the standard analytics and data solutions like game analytics and Firebase. But about halfway through our journey, we had an intuition that what these tools were providing us uh, wasn't enough. And we had a hunch that there was hidden insights to be found if we looked more closely at the data. And so what we did next is something that I would normally advise against. I would strongly advise against it. And so we actually went ahead and built our own lightweight analytics solution. And so it's a very dangerous thing to do. It's the modern day equivalent of reinventing the wheel. But in our specific case, it turned out to be totally worth the time investment. And so we came up with a system we call Sage, and we're incredibly proud of it. And it's helped us really streamline our data processes. And and much more than that, it has helped us discover a lot of insights that we would normally have missed using normal analytics tools. And I'm going to give you some examples of the things that we have been able to do using Sage. Now, the most basic thing, and one of the first things we did using Sage, was that Sage gave us a rough outlook on a real-time outlook on how each of our games were doing over time. And so what it enabled us to do was that we could see if let's say an update for a game was actually improving the KPIs for that game, or it actually made that game worse. But that's not all Sage enabled us to do. And where Sage really shined was in helping us find valuable insights about our players' behavior. And I'm going to share two of these insights with you now. And the first one is that the diagram you see before you is a chart and each bar on this chart represents one of our games, the engagement for one of our games. And the way we define engagement is the total number of minutes that a player on average spends in one of our games up to a certain point in time. And the blue part of these bars is the average engagement of our players on the first day of playing the game. Now, you might have heard that the conventional wisdom of hyper casual states that you should focus only on the first few sessions of your game, that the players are not going to stick around for long. What we found here was that if you look at the yellow part of these bars, which is the total engagement time in minutes of our players from the end of the first day up until the end of the 30th day, you will see that actually more than 50% of our playtime, of our engagement from our players, comes from after the first day. And so this insight that we found actually goes against popular wisdom in hyper casual. And we found that trying to improve your long-term engagement actually matters in hyper casual. Another thing that we found using Sage was that I want to draw your attention to the two bars in this diagram that haven't been grayed out. This diagram shows the retention data for some of our games, and we define retention, of course, as the proportion of our players that come back and play the game on the day after the day they installed the game. And in hypercasual, retention is one of the most important metrics by which the industry evaluates a game. And so going with a conventional wisdom, we would have assumed that the two games, which are represented with the blue and red bars, would roughly be of the same value in the hyper-casual market. The red bar shows a 32% retention rate, and the blue bar shows about a 36% retention rate. And so going by conventional wisdom, we would have assumed that these two games have the same value. And but what we actually found amazed us. And so we use Sage to look at the actual engagement data for these two games, and how much the players actually, how long the players actually played these games. And the results were shocking. The game with the low retention actually turned out to have more than double the engagement of the game with the higher retention rate. And so if we were to only use conventional wisdom, we would have assumed that the game with the lower retention would be less valuable, but it actually turned out to be much more profitable than the game with the higher retention rate. And the lesson for us here, and the insight that we found, was that the retention isn't everything, and there are a lot of factors that matter when deciding whether a game has potential and value or not. And while Sage gave us real-time access to all of this data, we also tasked it with providing us daily reports of how our games were doing. And so we could always keep a lookout on the KPIs of our games at all times. And not only that, we also tasked Sage with providing us with a list of all the hyper-casual games every day that were released the day before. And so Sage also helped us stay on top of the market. And so we were able to see where the market was headed and how the trends were changing. And so Sage was such an incredible tool for us that we thought that it was incredibly, it was totally worth the time investment that we made for it. And what I'm proposing here is not that you should necessarily go ahead and build your own analytics solution. What I'm saying here is that if you look closely at the data you collect from your players, there is always valuable insights to be found. And in hyper-casual, data is king. And so, sort of sum up what I just told you about the hyper-casual mindset. I first talked a little bit about hyper-casual game design and talked about the basic principle that your game should be both clear and fun, and how this principle is going to be tremendously helpful to you over the long run when deciding whether or not to build a game. Then I talked a little bit about the technical side of things when building hyper-casual games, and that you should always think about which parts of your assets and your code you can reuse, and that's really going to give you an edge over the competition. And in the end, I talked a little bit about how analyzing your data closely can lead you to valuable insights about how your players behave in your games. And so I hope this talk was useful to you, and that you won't have to make a lot of mistakes that we made along the way. And I wish you all the best of luck. And thank you very much for taking the time to listen to me. And goodbye.